Hi everyone, welcome to the channel After All That Years.
I never imagined I'd be the type of man to spy on his own wife. But there I was, at 62, sitting in my car across from a downtown hotel, watching the woman I'd loved for 15 years walk hand in hand with another man. Looking back now, I realize the signs had been there for months, maybe even longer. The way Janet would suddenly stop talking when I entered a room, the mysterious phone calls she'd step outside to take, the new clothes that appeared in her wardrobe without explanation. But when you trust someone completely, when you've built a life together, brick by brick, over 13 years of marriage, you find ways to rationalize the inconsistencies. You tell yourself it's work stress, middle-age restlessness, or simply the natural evolution of a long relationship. I suppose I was willfully blind because the alternative was too painful to consider. It started 3 weeks earlier when Janet mentioned she'd been invited to what she called a networking mixer for her marketing firm. After 13 years of marriage, I'd grown accustomed to her occasional work events, though something about this one felt different. She seemed almost giddy as she described it, her fingers drumming against the kitchen counter in a way that suggested nervous excitement rather than professional obligation. "It's just some client appreciation thing," she said, not quite meeting my eyes as she rummaged through the mail. "You know how these corporate things go, boring speeches and overpriced wine." I looked up from my newspaper. "Anyone I know going?" The slightest pause. "Just office people. Nobody you've met." That hesitation, barely a heartbeat, planted something uncomfortable in my chest. In all our years together, Janet had never been evasive about her work life. She was naturally social, the kind of person who made friends easily and loved introducing me to new people. This secretiveness was unlike her. The evening of the event, she took longer getting ready than I'd seen in months. She emerged from our bedroom, wearing a burgundy dress I didn't recognize, paired with jewelry that seemed too elegant for a simple work function. When I complimented her appearance, her smile seemed forced. "Don't wait up," she said, kissing my cheek. "These things usually run late." After she left, I wandered through our house like a ghost, haunting his own life. I tried settling into my usual routine, checking emails, watching the news, reading a few chapters of the biography I'd been working through for months. But concentration eluded me completely. Something gnawed at the edges of my thoughts, a persistent unease that made my skin crawl and my stomach churn. I found myself standing in our bedroom, staring at the jewelry box she'd left slightly open on the dresser. Inside, I could see the empty spot where her grandmother's pearl earrings usually sat, the ones she only wore for truly special occasions. Why would she wear them to a boring work mixer? I closed the box and walked away. But the question followed me downstairs. Around 10:30, I found myself checking her social media accounts. It wasn't something I made a habit of, but I thought seeing a few photos from her evening might ease whatever was bothering me. Her profiles showed nothing recent, which struck me as odd, given how frequently she shared updates about her daily activities. Then I remembered Gregory, one of her colleagues, who'd tagged her in photos from previous company events. I navigated to his profile and scrolled through his recent posts. There it was, a group photo taken that very evening, people clustered around cocktail tables in what appeared to be an upscale restaurant rather than a conference room. My heart sank when I spotted Janet in the background. She was standing remarkably close to a man I'd never seen before, his arm draped casually around her shoulders. Her body language suggested comfort, familiarity, nothing like the polite distance you'd maintain with a mere colleague. I stared at that image until my eyes burned. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was innocent. But the longer I looked, the more convinced I became that something was wrong. Without fully deciding to do it, I grabbed my car keys and drove to the address tagged in Gregory's post. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I navigated through the downtown traffic, my mind racing between rational explanations and darker possibilities. Maybe she was just being friendly. Maybe the photo captured an innocent moment out of context. Maybe I was becoming one of those paranoid husbands who sees threats where none exist. But even as I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, a deeper part of me knew better. 15 years with someone teaches you their patterns, their habits, their tells, and everything about Janet's behavior lately suggested she was living a secret life I knew nothing about. The restaurant buzzed with conversation and laughter that spilled out onto the sidewalk. Through the large front windows, I could see the party in full swing. And there was Janet, no longer in the background, but front and center, engaged in animated conversation with the same man from the photo. They stood close enough that their shoulders touched, and when he whispered something in her ear, she threw her head back and laughed in a way I hadn't seen in years. I watched them for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When they moved toward the exit, I quickly got back in my car, my pulse racing. I followed at a distance as they walked to her sedan, where they embraced in the parking lot before she drove away. The drive home passed in a fog of disbelief and rage that came in waves. One moment I felt numb, disconnected from reality, and the next I was gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white as fury coursed through my veins. I kept replaying what I'd witnessed, the easy intimacy between them, the way she'd thrown her head back when he whispered in her ear, the comfortable familiarity that spoke of a relationship far beyond casual acquaintance. How long had this been going on? How many lies had she told me? How many evenings had she come home from supposed work events, kissed me goodnight, and climbed into our bed, carrying the scent of another man? By the time I pulled into our driveway, the initial shock had crystallized into cold determination. If Janet wanted to live a double life, I wasn't going to make it easy for her. More than that, I was going to make sure she faced the full consequences of her deception. She arrived home just after midnight, humming softly as she kicked off her heels. I was sitting in the living room with a glass of bourbon, still fully dressed. "Oh, you're awake," she said, seeming genuinely surprised. "How was your evening?" "Quiet," I replied, studying her face. "How was the networking event?" "Fine," she answered quickly. "Typical corporate stuff. Long speeches, mediocre food." I nodded slowly. "Glad you had a chance to connect with colleagues." She didn't linger to chat, instead disappearing upstairs with a muttered comment about being tired. As I listened to the shower running above me, I began formulating a plan. Over the next several days, I maintained the facade of the trusting husband while quietly gathering evidence with methodical precision. I'd spent enough time reading legal forums and watching crime documentaries over the years to know that documentation would be crucial if this situation escalated to divorce proceedings. Every text message, every credit card charge, every social media interaction needed to be preserved and catalogued. The process was emotionally brutal, but necessary. Each evening, after Janet went to bed, I would carefully photograph her phone screen, documenting conversations that made my heart sink further into my chest. Her messages were carefully crafted to avoid explicit language, but the subtext was unmistakable to anyone who knew how to read between the lines. I also discovered she had a second email account I'd never known about, one she accessed through her laptop when she thought I was occupied. The password was embarrassingly simple, the name of our first dog combined with the year we got married. The irony of her using our shared history to hide her betrayal wasn't lost on me. What I discovered in that secret email account confirmed my worst suspicions and revealed details that made my stomach turn. There were messages dating back nearly 8 months, chronicling the development of their relationship from initial flirtation to full-blown affair. Her correspondence revealed a side of Janet I'd never seen, playful, passionate, completely uninhibited in ways she hadn't been with me in years. But it was the photos that delivered the final blow to whatever remained of my trust and respect for the woman I'd married. Hidden in carefully organized folders were dozens of intimate images, pictures of Janet and her lover looking like honeymooners on weekend getaways I'd never heard about, romantic dinners at expensive restaurants, cozy moments in hotel rooms that must have cost a fortune. Each image felt like a physical assault, but I forced myself to save every single one. My lawyer would need comprehensive evidence, and I was determined to leave no stone unturned. The credit card statements told their own story of deception and financial betrayal. Charges at high-end restaurants during lunch hours when Janet claimed to be in back-to-back meetings. Hotel bookings for weekend conferences that apparently didn't exist. Expensive lingerie purchases from boutiques I'd never heard her mention. Even spa treatments and salon appointments that she'd never mentioned to me, despite the fact that we'd always shared details about our daily activities. What stung most was discovering she'd been using our joint account to fund her affair. Every romantic dinner, every hotel room, every gift she'd bought for him. It was all paid for with money I'd earned through 60-hour work weeks and careful financial planning. She wasn't just betraying our marriage. She was stealing from our shared future to pay for her deception. The following weekend, Janet announced another work event, this time described as a team-building retreat. I smiled, kissed her goodbye, and waited exactly 15 minutes before following her. She drove to a boutique hotel on the other side of town. I parked where I could observe the entrance and waited. 20 minutes later, her companion from the restaurant arrived. They met in the lobby with an embrace that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. I photographed everything. Their arrival, their embrace, their walk to the elevator together. The images weren't artistic, but they were clear enough to serve their purpose. As I sat in my car, watching the hotel entrance, I felt something shift inside me. The last vestiges of hope that this might all be some terrible misunderstanding finally died. When Janet returned home that evening, she spun elaborate tales about team-building exercises and trust falls, describing colleagues and conversations that I now knew were complete fabrications. She spoke with such conviction, such apparent sincerity, that if I hadn't seen the evidence with my own eyes, I might have believed her. But listening to her lie so effortlessly to my face was perhaps more disturbing than discovering the affair itself. It made me question everything, not just our recent interactions, but years of conversations, explanations, and reassurances. How long had she been this comfortable with deception? How many other lies had I accepted without question? Beverly Chen's law office occupied the 15th floor of a gleaming downtown high-rise, and her reputation for handling complex divorce cases was legendary among the legal community. She was exactly the kind of attorney I needed, sharp, experienced, and completely unsentimental about the realities of failed marriages. "This is remarkably comprehensive documentation," she said, closing the thick folder I'd brought her and leaning back in her leather chair. "In 30 years of practice, I've rarely seen such thorough evidence gathering. You've essentially built an airtight case." Her words should have made me feel vindicated, but instead, I felt hollow. "I never thought I'd be sitting in a divorce lawyer's office," I admitted. "Even 3 weeks ago, I would have laughed if someone suggested my marriage was in trouble." Beverly nodded, with the understanding of someone who'd heard similar stories countless times. "Betrayal is often invisible until it isn't. The question now is how you want to proceed. We can file immediately, or we can wait until you've decided exactly how you want to handle the personal side of this situation." Her words crystallized something for me. This wasn't about revenge. It was about protecting myself from further deception. I spent the following week making careful preparations for what I knew would be the most difficult conversation of my life. The decision to involve our friends wasn't made lightly. I agonized over whether public humiliation was too cruel, whether I was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But ultimately, I realized that Janet's betrayal hadn't occurred in a vacuum. She'd lied not just to me, but to everyone in our social circle, spinning elaborate stories to cover her tracks and making fools of people who cared about both of us. Our friends deserved to know the truth, and Janet deserved to face the full consequences of her deception. More pragmatically, I needed witnesses who could later testify about her admission of guilt if the divorce proceedings became contentious. I reached out to 6 people who had been closest to us throughout our marriage, couples who had shared holidays, vacations, and countless dinner parties over the years. People who had always seemed slightly skeptical of Janet's frequent work obligations, but had been too polite or too loyal to voice their doubts directly. The conversations with our friends were delicate affairs. I couldn't reveal the true purpose of the gathering without ruining the element of surprise, but I needed to ensure that the right people would be present for what was about to unfold. "Just felt like bringing everyone together," I told Harold, one of our oldest couple friends. "You know how life gets busy and we lose touch. Thought it would be nice to catch up." Each person I called expressed genuine enthusiasm about the idea, and several mentioned how much they'd miss seeing Janet and me together regularly. Their warmth and obvious affection for us both made what I was planning even more painful, but it also reinforced my conviction that they deserved to know the truth about the person they'd been trusting and defending. What I didn't mention to any of them was that they would be witnessing the end of my marriage and the complete destruction of Janet's reputation in our community. That Saturday evening, Janet left for yet another supposed work function, this time wearing an emerald green dress that hugged her figure perfectly. She kissed me goodbye, completely unaware that her carefully constructed lies were about to crumble. After she left, I made final preparations for the next day's revelation, working with the methodical precision of someone preparing for battle. I organized all the evidence into individual presentation folders, text message printouts, photographs, credit card statements, hotel receipts, creating a complete timeline of Janet's deception for each guest to review. I also prepared a backup USB drive with digital copies of everything, knowing that Janet might attempt to deny the evidence or claim it had been fabricated. The drive was hidden in my office safe, along with copies of all the financial documents that proved she'd been using our joint accounts to fund her affair. As I worked, I found myself thinking about the friends who would be arriving tomorrow, imagining their shock and disappointment when they learned the truth about someone they'd trusted and admired. Part of me felt guilty for involving them in something so ugly and personal. But another part of me recognized that Janet's lies had made them unwitting accomplices in her deception, and they deserved the chance to make informed decisions about their future relationships with both of us. Sunday morning arrived gray and overcast, with heavy clouds that seemed to mirror the weight in my chest. Janet slept late, exhausted from whatever activities had kept her out until nearly 2 a.m. When she finally came downstairs around 10, she moved with the languid satisfaction of someone who had thoroughly enjoyed herself the night before. She seemed genuinely pleased by the effort I'd put into preparing for our guests. Fresh flowers on the dining table, an elaborate spread of pastries and fruit, coffee brewing in the good china service we usually reserved for holidays. "This is absolutely lovely, Walter," she said, surveying the setup with obvious approval. "What's the special occasion? Did I forget an anniversary or something?" The casual way she mentioned anniversaries, as if they were trivial things that might slip one's mind, struck me as particularly ironic, given what I was about to reveal. "Just felt like seeing everyone," I replied, marveling at my ability to keep my voice steady. She moved around the kitchen with easy familiarity, adding final touches to the presentation and chatting about mundane topics as if this were any other Sunday. Watching her perform this domestic charade, while knowing what she'd been doing for the past 8 months, filled me with a cold fury that I struggled to contain. By 1 o'clock, 6 of our closest friends had arrived. Janet played the perfect hostess, laughing and chatting as if she didn't have a care in the world. I watched her move between conversations with practiced charm, marveling at how convincing she could be. The moment had arrived. I could feel my heart pounding as I stood up, the stack of manila folders feeling heavier than they should in my hands. The room gradually quieted as conversations died away and all eyes turned toward me. Janet sat on the couch between Margaret and Susan, still smiling with that easy confidence that had always been one of her most attractive qualities. "What's this about, Walter?" she asked, her voice light, but with just the slightest edge of wariness. Her eyes had fixed on the folders, and I could see her mind racing to figure out what I might be planning. I took a deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes would change everything for everyone in this room. "I wanted to share something important with all of you, something I've recently discovered that I think everyone deserves to know." The lightness drained from Janet's expression as the implications of my words began to sink in. She glanced around the room, perhaps looking for allies or escape routes, but found only curious and increasingly concerned faces staring back at her. "Walter," she said, her voice taking on a warning tone, "what are you doing?" Instead of answering her directly, I opened the first folder with deliberate care and held up the photograph I'd taken outside the hotel, Janet and her lover in an intimate embrace that left no room for misinterpretation. The room erupted in gasps and whispered exclamations. Janet's face drained of color as the reality of my intentions hit her. "Walter, stop," she hissed, her voice trembling. "We don't need to do this here." But I was past caring about her comfort. "Actually, Janet, I think we do." One by one, I distributed the folders to our stunned friends. They flipped through the evidence with expressions of disbelief and disgust. The room filled with uncomfortable murmurs as people processed what they were seeing. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" asked Helen, one of Janet's longtime friends. "Janet, please tell me this isn't real." Janet opened her mouth several times, but no words came. Finally, she sank into her chair, burying her face in her hands. "How could you do this?" muttered another friend, his voice thick with disgust. I stepped forward, my voice calm, despite the storm of emotions inside me. "Janet made her choices. She lied to me, to all of us, and now she gets to face the consequences." Janet finally looked up. Her mascara streaked down her cheeks. "Walter, please, can we talk about this privately?" I shook my head firmly. "You lost the right to privacy when you decided to betray our marriage vows." The room fell silent, except for Janet's quiet sobs. I didn't feel victorious, but I did feel something I hadn't experienced in months. Relief. The weight of her deception was no longer mine to carry alone. After what seemed like an eternity, Janet stood up unsteadily. She looked around the room, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry," she whispered. But her apology fell on deaf ears. No one responded. The damage was too extensive for simple words to repair. She turned to me, her eyes pleading. "Walter, please, I'll do anything to fix this." I met her gaze with steady resolve. "You've already done enough." Without another word, I left the room and went upstairs. I sat on the edge of our bed, listening to the muffled conversations below. Eventually, I heard the front door opening and closing repeatedly as our friends departed. The house fell quiet, except for Janet's footsteps, pacing in the living room. Hours later, she finally climbed the stairs. She stood in the bedroom doorway, clutching a tissue, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. "Walter," she began, her voice raw from crying. "Can we talk?" I didn't look up from the book I was pretending to read. "I think we've said everything that needs saying." She moved closer, desperation creeping into her voice. "I'm sorry. I made terrible mistakes, but I can fix this. We can work through this together." I finally met her eyes, my expression cold. "You can't repair something you've completely destroyed, Janet. It doesn't work that way." Her lip quivered as she perched on the edge of the bed. "I don't want to lose you." A bitter laugh escaped me. "You lost me the moment you chose to lie, the moment you chose him over me. I just didn't realize it until recently." She dissolved into tears again, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I felt a flicker of something, pity perhaps, but it wasn't enough to change my mind. That night, I slept in the guest room. The bed felt cold and unfamiliar, but at least I didn't have to share it with someone who had betrayed everything we'd built together. The next morning, Janet was already awake when I came downstairs. She sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at an untouched cup of coffee. "I've been thinking," she said quietly when she noticed me. "I could move out for a while, give you some space to process everything." I poured myself coffee, keeping my back to her. "That would be a start." She nodded, swallowing hard. "I could stay with my sister in Portland, just temporarily, until we figure out what comes next." The mention of her sister almost made me laugh. Another relationship she'd probably have to explain and potentially destroy with her actions. "Fine," I said, finally turning to face her. "Take whatever you need, but don't expect me to wait around indefinitely while you figure out what you want." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't argue. Instead, she stood up slowly, moving like someone who'd aged years overnight. By evening, Janet had packed several suitcases and left. The house felt different without her presence, not empty exactly, but cleaner somehow, as if the air itself had been purified. Over the next few days, I began the process of untangling our shared life. I met with Beverly Chen again to begin divorce proceedings, ensuring every detail was documented and legally sound. Janet sent several text messages over the following weeks, apologies, pleas for reconciliation, promises to change, but I didn't respond. I wasn't ready to reopen that door, and truthfully, I wasn't sure I ever would be. The divorce papers were served within 2 weeks. Janet's response was predictably emotional. She called immediately, her voice shaky and desperate. "Walter, is this really necessary? Can't we at least try counseling first?" "I don't see what good talking would do at this point," I replied calmly. "You made your choices, Janet. Now, we both have to live with the consequences." There was a long pause before she spoke again. "I never meant for any of this to happen. You have to believe me. Whether you meant it or not doesn't change the fact that it did happen," I said, and ended the call. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life. I threw myself into work, taking on consulting projects that had been languishing for months. I started exercising again, something I'd neglected during the final years of my marriage. The physical activity was therapeutic, and the routine gave me structure during a time when everything else felt uncertain. Janet, according to mutual friends, was struggling. There were reports of tearful phone calls and dramatic declarations about how much she regretted her actions. I didn't respond to any of her attempts to reach out, instructing Beverly to handle all communication. One evening, about 6 weeks after Janet had moved out, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "I need to see you. Please. Just once. It's important. Janet." I stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "If it's about the divorce, talk to my lawyer. If it's not, I don't see the point." Her response came almost immediately. "It's not about the divorce. Please, Walter. Just 5 minutes." Against my better judgment, I agreed. I wasn't sure what she could possibly say that would make any difference, but part of me wanted closure, or at least to see how far she was willing to go to try to salvage what remained of our relationship. We met 2 days later at a coffee shop in a part of town where we were unlikely to run into anyone we knew. Janet looked different, thinner, older somehow, as if the weight of her actions had finally begun to crush her spirit. She fidgeted nervously with her coffee cup as I sat down across from her. "I don't even know where to begin," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then don't," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "What do you want, Janet?" She winced at my directness, but pressed on. "I want to fix this. I want to fix us." I shook my head, unable to suppress a bitter laugh. "You can't fix what you've broken, Janet. Trust isn't something you can just glue back together." "I know," she said, tears beginning to well up, "but I still love you. I never stopped loving you." The word love coming from her lips made my jaw clench. "You call what you did love? Sneaking around, lying to my face, making a fool of me in front of our friends? That's not love, Janet. That's selfishness." She flinched, as if I'd physically struck her, but I felt no satisfaction in causing her pain. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears now flowing freely. "I don't know what else to say." "Then don't say anything," I replied, standing up. "It's over, Janet. It's been over for longer than either of us wanted to admit." She reached out as if to stop me, but I stepped back. "Take care of yourself," I said, and walked away without looking back. That night, for the first time in months, I slept peacefully. It wasn't just the end of our marriage. It was the end of her hold over me. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine freedom. The months following my final meeting with Janet brought a peace I hadn't expected. There were no more desperate phone calls, no surprise visits, no frantic messages. It was as if she had finally accepted what I had known for some time. We were finished. I used this period to focus entirely on myself, something I had neglected for far too long. My mornings began with long walks through the neighborhood, sometimes extending into the nearby park, where I'd sit on a bench and plan out my day. The simple routine of physical movement and quiet reflection helped me work through the lingering anger and disappointment that Janet's betrayal had left behind. At work, I found renewed energy and purpose. I took on challenging projects that I'd been avoiding, earned recognition from colleagues who noticed my improved focus, and even received a promotion that came with both increased responsibility and better compensation. For the first time in years, I felt like I was moving forward instead of just maintaining the status quo. The biggest change, though, came in my social life. I began accepting invitations I would have previously declined. Dinner parties, weekend trips to wine country, even a pottery class that my neighbor had recommended. Slowly, I started rebuilding the parts of myself that had been diminished during my marriage. I realized that Janet hadn't just betrayed me. She had somehow made me smaller, less confident, less willing to take risks or try new things. One evening, about 4 months after the confrontation, I found myself at a small dinner party hosted by colleagues from work. Initially, I had hesitated to attend, worried that it might dredge up uncomfortable memories. Many of the same people who had witnessed Janet's humiliation would be there, and I wasn't entirely sure how to handle their potential pity or awkwardness. But the evening turned out to be revelatory. My friends welcomed me warmly, their concern replaced by genuine happiness at seeing me engaged and present again. It felt wonderful to laugh, to contribute to conversations, to feel like part of a community without the constant shadow of Janet's deception looming over everything. It was at this gathering that I met someone who would change my perspective on relationships entirely. Her name was Rose, and she worked in the accounting department of a nearby firm. Unlike Janet, who had always commanded attention with her dramatic flair and magnetic personality, Rose had a quieter presence that drew people in gradually. We found ourselves talking about books. She had just finished the same biography I'd been struggling to get through months earlier when my world was falling apart. Our conversation flowed naturally from literature to travel to our shared appreciation for old movies. Before I knew it, we had spent the entire evening engrossed in discussion, barely noticing when other guests began to leave. As the party wound down, Rose slipped me her business card with a shy smile. If you ever want to discuss that book further, or maybe recommend something new to each other, give me a call. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a spark of something I thought I had lost: hope for genuine connection with another person. Over the following months, Rose and I developed a friendship that slowly deepened into something more meaningful. She was patient and understanding in ways that felt rare and precious. I didn't burden her with the entire story of my failed marriage right away, but when I eventually opened up about Janet's betrayal and the painful process of rebuilding my life, Rose listened without judgment or false sympathy. "It sounds like you handled an impossible situation with dignity," she said one evening as we sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "That takes real strength." Her words meant more to me than any dramatic declaration of support ever could have. Rose understood that healing wasn't about forgetting or forgiving. It was about learning to trust yourself again, to believe that you deserved better than deception and half-truths. As our relationship grew, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. Janet's betrayal had been devastating, yes, but it had also been a catalyst. It forced me to confront aspects of myself I had been ignoring, to rebuild not just my life, but my sense of self-worth from the ground up. 1 year after that terrible Sunday, when I had exposed Janet's lies to our friends, I was sitting in my garden with Rose, both of us reading quietly in the afternoon sunshine. The contrast with my old life was striking. Where there had been constant tension and unspoken resentment with Janet, there was now peaceful companionship. Where there had been doubt and suspicion, there was now trust, built on honesty and transparency. "I'm grateful you took that risk," I said suddenly, looking up from my book. Rose glanced at me with curious eyes. "What risk?" "Giving me your card that night. Taking a chance on someone who was probably more broken than he wanted to admit." She smiled, the kind of gentle expression that had first drawn me to her. Sometimes broken things, when they're repaired properly, end up stronger than they were before. As I sat there in the warm afternoon sun, I realized something profound. I wasn't angry anymore. The bitterness, the sense of betrayal, the consuming rage that had driven me to expose Janet so publicly, all of it had faded into something much more manageable. The experience had changed me, certainly, but it no longer defined me. I thought about Janet occasionally, wondering how she was rebuilding her own life after the destruction she had caused. I felt no desire for revenge or further punishment. That chapter was closed, its lessons learned and internalized. Looking at Rose as she turned a page in her novel, completely absorbed in the story, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine contentment. Not the desperate happiness that comes from trying to convince yourself everything is fine, but the deep satisfaction of knowing that your life is authentically your own. The future stretched out ahead of me, full of possibilities I was finally ready to embrace. At 63, I had learned that it's never too late to start over, never too late to demand honesty and respect from the people in your life. Janet's betrayal had taught me that painful lesson, but it had also freed me to find something better. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of red and gold, I reached over and took Rose's hand. She squeezed back gently, and I knew that whatever came next, I would face it with the hard-won wisdom of someone who had survived betrayal and emerged stronger on the other side. The past was finally behind me, and the future was mine to write.